Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most extreme survival challenges. And honestly, by the time we're done with these three incredible stories, you'll have enough mind-blowing conversation starters to make you the most interesting person at any campfire. We're talking about lifestyles so hardcore that they make modern extreme sports look like gentle yoga sessions. Picture this. You're scrolling through your phone, maybe sipping some tea, getting ready to wind down for the night. The air around you is calm. Maybe there's a gentle breeze coming through your window, and everything feels perfectly comfortable. Now imagine living in a world where your entire house can be packed up and moved in under an hour, where winter temperatures drop to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and where your survival depends entirely on reading the sky, the grass, and the behavior of animals. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly wild. The people who mastered this impossible lifestyle didn't just survive, they built the largest contiguous empire in human history. Now, forget what you think you know about nomadic life being all romantic horseback riding and freedom under endless skies, because the truth is way more brutal and fascinating than any movie could make it. And honestly, our Mongol ancestors were basically running the medieval equivalent of a military survival boot camp that never ended, where graduation meant you got to conquer the known world. So before we dive in, hit that like button if you're ready to discover some seriously wild historical facts that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about what humans can endure. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing our global community of history lovers and insomniacs unite over these incredible survival stories. Now grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let's find out why living in a Mongol gur wasn't just housing. It was the ultimate test of human adaptability. It's dawn on the Mongolian steppes in the 13th century, and the smell of burning, dried yak dung fills the air as families begin their daily routine of survival. The sound of felt walls flapping in the constant wind creates a rhythm that becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat, because in the Mongol Empire, your home isn't just where you live. It's a portable fortress that can mean the difference between life and death. The feel of rough wool against your skin becomes as natural as breathing, because comfort is a luxury that nomads can't afford when every day is a masterclass in staying alive. But here's where this story gets absolutely mind-blowing. The average Mongol family owned everything they needed to survive in a space smaller than most modern studio apartments. We're talking about a gur, what most people call a yurt, that's maybe 15 feet in diameter, housing an entire family, plus their most precious possessions. It's like living in a tiny house movement, except your tiny house has to withstand hurricanes, blizzards, and the occasional enemy raid. The most quotable thing about Mongol nomadic life is that they didn't just live with nature, they became nature. While sedentary civilizations were busy building walls to keep the world out, Mongols were learning to read the world like a survival manual written in grass, clouds, and animal behavior. The taste of fermented mare's milk becomes as familiar as coffee is to us, because when you're constantly moving, you need nutrition that travels well and doesn't spoil. What makes this lifestyle so universally fascinating is how it reveals the incredible adaptability of human beings. Every Mongol child learned to ride a horse before they could properly walk, not because it was fun, but because mobility was literally survival. Picture trying to teach a 3-year-old to drive a car because walking might get them killed. That's the level of intensity we're talking about. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. Mongols were essentially the ultimate minimalists, but their minimalism wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a survival strategy. Every single possession had to earn its place in the gur, by being either essential for survival or valuable enough to trade. It's like Marie Kondo meets Bear Grylls, except the stakes are life and death. But what's really beautiful about this nomadic existence is how it created an incredibly tight-knit community structure. When your survival depends on your neighbors, social cooperation isn't just nice, it's absolutely mandatory. The sound of multiple families working together to move camp becomes a symphony of human cooperation that puts modern teamwork to shame. The psychological resilience required for this lifestyle is almost incomprehensible to modern minds. Mongol families would pack up their entire lives and move to completely new territory based on nothing more than the color of the grass or the direction of the wind. It's like being so in tune with your environment that you can predict the future just by paying attention to details most people never notice. What's absolutely mind-blowing about Mongol adaptability is how they turned every challenge into an advantage. Harsh winters that would kill sedentary populations became training seasons that made Mongol warriors incredibly tough. The feel of bitter cold becomes familiar rather than feared, because when you can survive a Mongolian winter, everything else seems manageable. The most heartbreaking part of this nomadic lifestyle is realizing how much knowledge and skill has been lost to history. These people could predict weather patterns weeks in advance, navigate by stars across thousands of miles, and keep entire herds healthy, using nothing but traditional knowledge passed down through generations. It's like watching a library of survival wisdom disappear as the world modernizes. Here's what makes this story so universally relatable. We've all been in situations where we've had to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Mongols represent the ultimate example of human flexibility, people who turned uncertainty into their greatest strength. Every time you've had to move, change jobs, or adapt to new technology, you're channeling a tiny bit of that nomadic spirit. But the real genius of Mongol nomadic life becomes clear when you understand the economics behind it. Their entire civilization was built around mobility, which meant they could access resources across vast territories that sedentary peoples could never reach. The smell of different grasslands becomes a map of opportunity, because nomads don't just live in one place, they live in an entire ecosystem. The most quotable wisdom from Mongol nomadic culture is that home isn't a place, it's the people you can count on when everything else is uncertain. While other civilizations were building monuments to permanence, Mongols were building relationships that could survive anything. The sound of familiar voices becomes more comforting than any physical shelter. What's really inspiring about this lifestyle is how it proves that humans can thrive in conditions that seem impossible. Every comfort we take for granted, central heating, grocery stores, permanent addresses, becomes irrelevant when you've mastered the art of living with nothing but what you can carry. It's like discovering that everything you thought you needed was actually just everything you'd gotten used to having. The psychological impact of this nomadic existence on Mongol identity cannot be overstated. When your home can be anywhere, and your survival depends on constant adaptation, you develop a mindset that sees the entire world as your territory. The feel of endless horizons becomes intoxicating when you realize that boundaries are just suggestions for people who don't know how to move. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. The people who owned the least stuff ended up conquering the people who owned the most. While sedentary civilizations were accumulating wealth and building defenses, Mongols were accumulating skills and building character. It's like watching someone with a backpack outcompete someone with a mansion. What happens next in our journey through Mongol life will make this nomadic foundation look like gentle preparation for the real challenges. because we're about to discover what daily life actually looked like inside those felt walls. And trust me, it's going to make every camping trip you've ever taken look like a luxury vacation. The real question isn't whether Mongols were tough, it's whether modern humans could survive even a single day of their normal lifestyle. And honestly, what we learn about the actual mechanics of Gur life will make every tiny house documentary you've ever watched seem like amateur hour. Because when your house has to be your fortress, your workshop, your social center, and your survival shelter all at the same time, every square foot becomes a masterpiece of efficient design. So we've just discovered that Mongol nomads were basically running the ultimate minimalist survival challenge. And now we're about to dive into something that will make every tiny house documentary you've ever watched look like luxury real estate. Because what happens when you actually step inside a Mongol gur isn't just about clever space saving. It's about witnessing a masterpiece of engineering that had to function as home, fortress, workshop, and survival shelter all at the same time. And honestly, if there's one thing that proves our ancestors understood efficiency better than any modern life coach, it's watching a Mongol family pack up their entire civilization and move it 20 miles before lunch. Picture this. You're standing outside a gur on a typical morning in 13th century Mongolia, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. The rich, earthy aroma of burning dried yak dung, mixed with the scent of fermented mare's milk, and the leather and wool smell of everything being constantly exposed to wind and weather. The sound of felt walls creaking in the endless steppe wind creates a rhythm that becomes the soundtrack to nomadic life. Because in Mongolia, silence means you're probably dead. Now, forget what you think you know about medieval homes being dark, cramped spaces where people just survived. Because a Mongol gur was essentially a portable smart home designed by people who understood that every square inch had to earn its place through pure functionality. The feel of stepping through that low doorway becomes like entering a different dimension where everything has been optimized for survival, mobility, and efficiency. But here's where this story gets absolutely mind-blowing. The entire structure of a gur can be assembled or disassembled by a family in under an hour, and every piece has been designed to fit perfectly onto pack animals for transport. It's like having furniture that transforms into its own moving truck, except your moving truck is a bunch of horses and yaks who also provide your food, clothing, and transportation. The most quotable thing about gur life is that Mongols didn't just live in their homes, they wore them, ate them, and rode them. The same animals that provided the felt for the walls also provided the milk for daily nutrition and the transportation for seasonal migrations. It's the ultimate example of sustainable living, where waste wasn't just avoided, it was literally impossible. What makes this lifestyle so universally fascinating is how it reveals the incredible ingenuity required for nomadic survival. Inside a typical gur, every object serves multiple purposes. The same wooden chest that stores clothes also functions as a seat, a table, and sometimes a bed. The taste of efficiency becomes as real as the taste of arag, fermented mare's milk. Because when you can only own what you can carry, every possession becomes precious. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. Mongol families were essentially living the ultimate work from home lifestyle, except their office moved every few weeks, and their commute involved herding thousands of animals across vast grasslands. While sedentary civilizations were building permanent structures, Mongols were perfecting the art of portable productivity. But what's really beautiful about gur design is how it reflects the Mongol understanding of social hierarchy and cosmic order. The interior space was divided into specific zones: the north side for honored guests and family treasures, the west for men's activities, the east for women's work, and the center for the sacred fire that literally kept everyone alive. The sound of daily activities becomes a carefully choreographed dance where everyone knows their role and their place. The psychological impact of this lifestyle on Mongol identity cannot be overstated. When your home can be anywhere, and your survival depends on reading natural signs that most people never notice, you develop a mindset that sees the entire world as your territory. The feel of constantly changing horizons becomes intoxicating when you realize that boundaries are just suggestions for people who don't know how to move. What's absolutely mind-blowing about seasonal migrations is the sheer scale of coordination required. Entire communities would move together, following ancient routes that had been perfected over generations, timing their movements to coincide with grass growth, weather patterns, and the needs of their animals. It's like a massive logistics operation, where the cargo is alive, the vehicles are animals, and the GPS is centuries of accumulated wisdom. The most heartbreaking part of this nomadic existence is realizing how much skill and knowledge was required just to survive a typical day. Mongol children learned to read weather patterns, animal behavior, and grass quality before they learned to read books, because literacy in nature was literally a matter of life and death. The smell of approaching storms becomes as familiar as the scent of home cooking, because knowing when to move could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Here's what makes this story so universally relatable. We've all experienced the stress of moving, but imagine if moving was your normal lifestyle. Mongols had to be ready to pack up and relocate at a moment's notice, not because of job changes or rent increases, but because the grass was getting thin or winter was coming early. Every decision becomes a calculation of risk versus reward, where being wrong means your entire family might not survive. But the real genius of Jir life becomes clear when you understand how it prepared Mongols for conquest. A people who could disassemble their entire civilization and move it hundreds of miles in a matter of days were perfectly suited for military campaigns that required incredible mobility and adaptability. The taste of constant movement becomes training for the ultimate military advantage. The most quotable wisdom from Mongol nomadic culture is that comfort is the enemy of survival, and survival is the foundation of everything else. While other civilizations were building bigger houses and accumulating more possessions, Mongols were perfecting the art of needing less while achieving more. The sound of wind through felt walls becomes a reminder that permanence is an illusion and adaptability is everything. What's really inspiring about this lifestyle is how it proves that humans can not only survive but thrive in conditions that seem impossible. Every modern convenience we take for granted, climate control, grocery stores, permanent addresses, becomes irrelevant when you've mastered the art of reading the natural world like a survival manual. It's like discovering that everything you thought you needed was actually just everything you'd gotten used to having. The psychological resilience required for this existence is almost incomprehensible to modern minds. Mongol families would wake up in one landscape and go to sleep in a completely different one, treating massive geographical changes as casually as we treat changing TV channels. The feel of endless possibility becomes intoxicating when you realize that your next home could be anywhere the grass grows and the water flows. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. The people who lived in the simplest homes ended up ruling the most complex empire in human history, while their enemies were trapped by their possessions and their permanent structures. Mongols were free to move, adapt, and conquer. It's like watching someone with a backpack outcompete someone with a mansion, except the stakes are entire civilizations. What happens next in our journey through Mongol life will make this daily survival routine look like gentle preparation for the ultimate test. Because we're about to discover what happened when the empire demanded everything from its people. And trust me, it's going to make every tax season you've ever experienced look like a gentle suggestion. The real question isn't whether Mongols were tough enough to survive on the steppes. It's whether they were tough enough to survive their own success. And honestly, what we learn about the price of building the world's largest empire will make every sacrifice you've ever made for your career look like amateur hour. Because when your emperor expects you to conquer the world while still maintaining your herds, raising your children, and surviving the steppes, every day becomes a masterclass in the impossible mathematics of nomadic imperial service. So we've just witnessed the incredible daily survival routine of Gur life on the steppes. And now we're about to discover something that will make every tax season you've ever experienced look like a gentle suggestion. Because what happens next isn't just about nomadic hardship, it's about the moment when building the world's largest empire required sacrifices so extreme that they redefined what it meant to be human. And honestly, if there's one thing that proves success can be more brutal than failure, it's watching the Mongol Empire demand everything from its people while somehow convincing them it was worth it. Picture this. You're a Mongol herder in 1220, and you've just finished the exhausting work of moving your family and animals to new pastures. The smell of horse sweat and dust fills the air as you finally settle into your gur for what you hope will be a few weeks of relative peace. The sound of your children playing outside mingles with the familiar bleating of goats and the distant neighing of horses. But then you hear something that makes your blood run cold. The thundering hoofbeats of imperial messengers approaching your camp with orders that will change your life forever. Now, forget what you think you know about medieval military service being a seasonal obligation that young men fulfilled for a few months. Because when Genghis Khan's empire called, it didn't just want your sons, it wanted your horses, your supplies, your knowledge, and sometimes your entire way of life. It's like getting a draft notice that requires you to provide not just soldiers, but also their transportation, their food, their equipment, and their replacement animals for the next several years. The most quotable thing about Mongol imperial service is that the empire didn't just conscript your body, it conscripted your entire existence. While other civilizations asked for tribute in gold or crops, the Mongols demanded something far more valuable: the complete restructuring of nomadic life to serve imperial ambitions. The taste of obligation becomes bitter when you realize that success means losing everything you've worked to build. But here's where this story gets absolutely mind-blowing. Every Mongol male between the ages of 15 and 70 was theoretically available for military service, and when the empire called, entire tribes would have to reorganize their lives around providing warriors, horses, and support. It's like if modern governments could draft not just people, but also their cars, their houses, and their entire extended families for indefinite periods. What makes this system so universally terrifying is how it reveals the true cost of imperial ambition. Mongol families would watch their young men ride away to conquer distant lands, knowing that many would never return, and those who did would be forever changed by years of warfare. The sound of departure becomes a funeral song played for the living, because even survivors of imperial campaigns often came home as strangers. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. The Mongol Empire essentially created the first total war economy, where every aspect of society was mobilized to support military expansion, while their enemies were fighting with professional armies. Mongols were fighting with their entire civilization. It's like the difference between hiring a contractor and moving your entire family into the construction site. But what's really heartbreaking about this imperial system is how it transformed nomadic culture from survival-focused to conquest-focused. Traditional Mongol life revolved around reading natural signs and adapting to environmental changes, but imperial life required reading political signs and adapting to military demands. The feel of grass under your feet becomes less important than the feel of a sword in your hand. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Mongol children who once learned to predict weather patterns and animal behavior now had to learn military formations and siege tactics. It's like watching a culture of environmental scientists get retrained as weapons specialists. The skills are impressive, but something essential gets lost in the translation. What's absolutely mind-blowing about the Mongol military system is how it turned nomadic advantages into imperial weapons. The same mobility that helped families survive harsh winters now enabled armies to appear anywhere without warning. The smell of freedom becomes the scent of conquest, as entire peoples discover that their greatest strengths can become their most dangerous obligations. The most quotable wisdom from this imperial transformation is that sometimes the price of building something great is losing everything that made you great in the first place. While Mongol military success was built on nomadic skills, the demands of empire gradually eroded the very lifestyle that created those skills. The sound of victory becomes hollow when you realize you've won the world but lost your soul. Here's what makes this story so universally relatable. We've all been in situations where success required sacrificing the things we valued most. Mongol herders represent every person who's ever had to choose between personal happiness and collective achievement. Every time you've worked late, instead of spending time with family, you're experiencing a tiny version of what imperial service demanded from nomadic peoples. But the real tragedy of Mongol imperial service becomes clear when you understand the human cost. Families that had survived for generations on the steppes suddenly found themselves broken apart by military obligations that could last for decades. The taste of separation becomes as familiar as the taste of mare's milk, because imperial success required personal sacrifice on an almost incomprehensible scale. What's really inspiring about this story is how it reveals the incredible resilience of nomadic culture. Despite the enormous pressures of imperial service, Mongol families found ways to maintain their traditions, their relationships, and their connection to the land. It's like watching people preserve their humanity in the face of a system designed to turn them into weapons. The most heartbreaking part of this imperial transformation is imagining the conversations in Mongol gurs as families tried to prepare their sons for military service. Parents who had spent years teaching children to read the natural world suddenly had to teach them to read the political world. The feel of a child's hand becomes precious when you know that hand will soon be holding weapons instead of reins. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. The empire that demanded everything from its people also gave them everything they never knew they wanted. While Mongol families sacrificed their traditional lifestyle, they gained access to wealth, knowledge, and opportunities that would have been impossible in purely nomadic life. It's like trading your small, comfortable house for a mansion that requires you to work 80 hours a week to maintain. The psychological complexity of this trade-off is almost impossible to comprehend. Mongol warriors who conquered cities filled with luxuries they'd never imagined still dreamed of the simple pleasures of herding animals across endless grasslands. The smell of foreign spices becomes exotic but never quite replaces the familiar scent of home. What's really beautiful about this story is how it demonstrates the incredible adaptability of human beings. Mongol families didn't just survive the transformation from nomadic herders to imperial subjects. They found ways to thrive while maintaining their essential identity. It's like watching people learn to swim in an ocean while never forgetting how to walk on land. The most quotable lesson from Mongol imperial service is that true strength isn't about avoiding change. It's about changing without losing yourself. While the empire demanded everything from its people, the people found ways to give everything while keeping something essential for themselves. The sound of imperial drums becomes background music to the quiet rhythm of families preserving what matters most. But here's what makes this story so eternally relevant. Every successful organization eventually faces the same challenge that faced the Mongol Empire: how to grow without destroying the culture that made growth possible. Whether it's a startup that becomes a corporation or a family business that goes global, the tension between success and identity is universal. What happens next in our journey through history's most extreme lifestyles will make this imperial transformation look like preparation for something even more remarkable. Because we're about to discover what happened when the world's largest empire finally achieved everything it wanted, and whether the price of ultimate success was worth paying. The real question isn't whether the Mongols conquered the world, it's whether conquering the world conquered them. And trust me, what we learn about the ultimate cost of imperial ambition will make every sacrifice you've ever made for success look like a gentle compromise. Because sometimes the most important lesson isn't how to achieve your dreams, it's how to survive achieving them. So we've just witnessed the Mongol Empire demand everything from its people in the name of conquest, and now we're about to discover something that will make every modern discussion about work-life balance look like a gentle philosophical debate. Because what happens next isn't just about the cost of imperial success, it's about the moment when an entire civilization realizes that achieving everything you ever dreamed of can sometimes mean losing everything that made those dreams worth having. And honestly, if there's one thing that proves the most dangerous victories are the ones that change you more than they change the world, it's watching the Mongol Empire discover that conquering everyone else meant conquering themselves. Picture this. It's 1279, and Kublai Khan is sitting in his magnificent palace in Beijing, surrounded by luxuries that would make modern billionaires jealous. The smell of exotic spices and silk fills the air as servants from dozens of conquered nations attend to his every need. The sound of courtly music and administrative discussions echoes through halls that stretch further than most medieval cities. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly tragic. This Mongol emperor, grandson of the great Genghis Khan, probably couldn't survive a single week in a traditional gur on the steppes. Now, forget what you think you know about imperial success being a simple story of winners and losers. Because the Mongol Empire's greatest victory, creating the largest contiguous land empire in human history, came at a cost that took generations to fully understand. It's like watching someone climb Mount Everest, only to discover that the view from the top shows them everything they left behind. The most quotable tragedy of Mongol imperial success is that they conquered the world so completely that the world conquered them back. While Mongol armies were busy absorbing the military techniques, administrative systems, and cultural practices of their enemies, those same influences were gradually transforming Mongol society from the inside out. The taste of victory becomes bittersweet when you realize that winning means becoming something you never intended to be. What makes this transformation so universally heartbreaking is how it reveals the hidden costs of unlimited success. By the late 13th century, many Mongol nobles had never lived in a gur, never herded animals, and never experienced the seasonal migrations that had defined their ancestors for thousands of years. It's like watching a family business become so successful that the grandchildren can't remember what the original business actually did. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. The Mongol Empire essentially created the first global economy, connecting trade routes from Europe to Asia and facilitating cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. While their ancestors survived by adapting to natural environments, Imperial Mongols had to adapt to political and economic environments that changed constantly. The feel of grass under your feet becomes a distant memory when you're walking on marble floors. But what's really beautiful about this imperial transformation is how it demonstrates the incredible resilience of human culture. Even as Mongol elites adopted Chinese, Persian, and European customs, ordinary Mongol families found ways to preserve their traditional knowledge and practices. It's like watching people maintain their roots, while their branches grow in completely unexpected directions. The psychological impact of this cultural transformation cannot be overstated. Mongol children growing up in conquered cities learned to read Chinese poetry and Persian literature, but many couldn't identify the plants and animals that their great-grandparents had depended on for survival. The sound of urban life becomes familiar, while the sound of wind across grasslands becomes exotic. What's absolutely mind-blowing about the Mongol Empire's legacy is how it created the foundation for modern globalization. The same trade routes, diplomatic practices, and cultural exchange networks that the Mongols established became the infrastructure for centuries of international commerce and communication. It's like watching someone accidentally invent the internet while trying to build a really efficient postal system. The most quotable wisdom from the Mongol imperial experience is that sometimes the most successful people are the ones who lose themselves in their own success. While Mongol military genius created unprecedented opportunities for wealth and power, it also created unprecedented challenges for maintaining cultural identity. The smell of foreign luxuries becomes intoxicating until you realize you've forgotten the scent of home. Here's what makes this story so universally relatable. We've all been in situations where achieving our goals required changing who we are. Mongol families represent every person who's ever had to choose between staying true to their roots and adapting to new opportunities. Every time you've moved to a new city for work or changed your lifestyle for success, you're experiencing a tiny version of what imperial transformation demanded from nomadic peoples. But the real tragedy of Mongol imperial success becomes clear when you understand the environmental cost. As more Mongols settled in cities and adopted sedentary lifestyles, their traditional knowledge of sustainable nomadic practices began to disappear. It's like watching a library of environmental wisdom get replaced by books about urban planning. Both valuable, but something irreplaceable gets lost in the translation. What's really inspiring about this story is how it reveals the incredible adaptability of human beings. Mongol families didn't just survive the transformation from nomadic herders to imperial administrators. Many found ways to thrive while maintaining essential connections to their heritage. The feel of silk robes becomes comfortable, but the memory of felt clothing remains precious. The most heartbreaking part of this imperial legacy is realizing how much knowledge and skill was lost to history. Traditional Mongol practices for reading weather patterns, managing animal herds, and surviving in harsh environments gradually disappeared as fewer people needed those skills. It's like watching a master craftsman's workshop get converted into a shopping mall. Progress, but at the cost of irreplaceable expertise. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. The empire that was built on nomadic mobility eventually became trapped by its own success. While early Mongol armies could move faster than any enemy could respond, later imperial forces became bogged down by the same administrative complexity and territorial obligations that had weakened their enemies. It's like watching a startup become so successful that it turns into the kind of bureaucratic corporation it originally set out to disrupt. The psychological complexity of this transformation is almost impossible to comprehend. Mongol leaders who commanded vast territories and millions of subjects sometimes felt nostalgic for the simple challenges of herding animals and surviving harsh winters. The sound of imperial ceremonies becomes magnificent, but never quite replaces the familiar rhythm of hoofbeats on grassland. What's really beautiful about the Mongol story is how it demonstrates that success and loss aren't opposites. They're often the same thing viewed from different angles. The empire that gave Mongols access to unprecedented wealth and power also gave them unprecedented responsibility and complexity. Every gain came with a corresponding loss. Every opportunity came with a corresponding obligation. The most quotable lesson from Mongol imperial history is that the price of conquering the world is often losing yourself, but the price of staying yourself is often losing the world. There's no perfect solution to the tension between growth and identity, between success and authenticity. The taste of this dilemma becomes familiar to anyone who's ever faced the choice between comfort and adventure. As we prepare to leave the vast steppes and imperial palaces of the Mongol Empire behind, remember that their story isn't really about ancient nomads or medieval conquest. It's about the eternal human struggle between staying true to who we are and becoming who we might be. The feel of that tension becomes as real as the wind that still blows across the grasslands where it all began. What happens next in our journey through history's most remarkable figures will make the Mongol Empire's transformation look like preparation for something even more extraordinary. Because we're about to meet someone who didn't just adapt to change, he created change that lasted for centuries. And he did it 500 years before anyone else even knew it was possible. Leif Erikson is waiting on the shores of Greenland, and he's about to show us what happens when someone refuses to accept that the edge of the world is actually the edge. The real wisdom of the Mongol story isn't about conquest or empire. It's about what it means to be human in a world where everything changes, including ourselves. They prove that sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones we win against our enemies, but the ones we win against our own limitations. And that's a lesson that transcends any particular century or culture. It's about what it means to grow, adapt, and somehow remain yourself in the process. So we've just witnessed the Mongol Empire discover that conquering the world sometimes means losing yourself. And now we're about to meet someone who proves that the most dangerous thing you can do is assume you know where the world ends. Because what happens next isn't just about Viking exploration. It's about a man who literally sailed off the edge of the known world and discovered that everything everyone thought they knew about geography was completely wrong. And honestly, if there's one person in history who proves that the best discoveries happen when you ignore everyone telling you something is impossible, it's Leif Erikson, the Norse explorer who beat Christopher Columbus to America by 500 years and probably never even realized he'd changed history forever. Picture this. You're scrolling through your GPS app, maybe planning a weekend road trip, confident that every road and landmark has been mapped and explored. The smell of coffee fills your car as you casually navigate to destinations that previous generations could never have imagined reaching. The sound of turn-by-turn directions becomes background noise as you take for granted that someone, somewhere, has already been everywhere you want to go. Now imagine living in a world where the Atlantic Ocean was literally the edge of existence, where sailing too far west meant falling off the world, and where the idea of land beyond Greenland was as fantastical as discovering aliens. Now, forget what you think you know about Viking explorers being random raiders who occasionally stumbled onto new lands. Because Leif Erikson was born into exploration royalty, his father was Eric the Red, the legendary Norse explorer who founded the first European settlements in Greenland around 985 CE. It's like being born into a family where your dad is Elon Musk and your childhood bedtime stories are about colonizing Mars. But here's where Leif's story gets absolutely mind-blowing. He wasn't even supposed to be the one who discovered America. The whole adventure started because of a guy named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who was just trying to sail from Iceland to Greenland around 985 CE when his ship got caught in fog and wind. Instead of reaching his destination, Bjarni accidentally sighted the coast of North America but never actually landed. It's like accidentally discovering a new continent, but being too focused on your original plans to stop and check it out. The most quotable thing about Leif's background is that he was raised in a family where impossible was just another word for hasn't been tried yet. Growing up in Greenland meant living on the absolute frontier of the known world, where survival required the kind of courage and adaptability that most people can't even imagine. The taste of adventure becomes as familiar as the taste of fermented shark, because when your backyard is the edge of civilization, every day is an expedition. What makes Leif's story so universally inspiring is how it demonstrates the power of curiosity over caution. Around the year 1000 CE, roughly 15 years after Bjarni's accidental sighting, Leif approached the trader, purchased his ship, and assembled a crew of 35 men to investigate these mysterious lands. It's like hearing about someone who saw something interesting on the horizon and deciding to spend your life savings to go check it out. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. Leif Erikson essentially became history's first venture capitalist, investing everything in an unproven concept based on second-hand information. While everyone else was content with the known world, Leif was willing to risk his life and fortune on the possibility that there might be something better beyond the horizon. But what's really beautiful about Leif's preparation is how it reveals the sophisticated planning behind Viking exploration. Even his father, Eric the Red, was supposed to join the expedition, but dropped out after falling from his horse on the way to the ship, an incident that everyone interpreted as a bad omen. The sound of that horse stumbling becomes the audio signature of how even legendary explorers understood that some journeys are too dangerous for everyone. The psychological profile of someone who attempts this kind of exploration is absolutely fascinating. Leif had to be confident enough to sail into completely unknown waters, while also being practical enough to plan for survival in conditions no European had ever experienced. It's like being simultaneously the most optimistic and most realistic person in your entire civilization. What's absolutely mind-blowing about Leif's expedition is how it represents the ultimate leap of faith. He's following Bjarni's route in reverse, sailing toward lands that might not even exist, with no backup plan and no way to call for help if things go wrong. The feel of ocean spray against your face becomes a constant reminder that you're literally sailing off the edge of the known world. The most quotable wisdom from life's decision to explore is that sometimes the most important discoveries happen when you're brave enough to investigate other people's accidents. While Bjarni saw unknown lands as an inconvenience that delayed his journey, Leif saw them as the opportunity of a lifetime. It's the difference between seeing problems and seeing possibilities. Here's what makes this story so universally relatable. We've all been in situations where we had to choose between the safe, known path and the risky, unknown adventure. Leif Erikson represents every person who's ever decided that the potential for discovery was worth the risk of failure. Every time you've taken a job in a new city, started a business, or tried something completely outside your comfort zone, you're channeling a tiny bit of that Viking explorer spirit. But what's really heartwarming about Leif's background is how it demonstrates the power of family legacy. Growing up as the son of Eric the Red meant being raised in an environment where exploration wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. The smell of salt air and the sound of waves become as familiar as home cooking when your family business is literally pushing the boundaries of the known world. The most inspiring part of Leif's story is how it proves that sometimes the most important thing you can inherit isn't money or property. It's the courage to attempt the impossible. While other young Norse men were content to follow traditional paths, Leif inherited a mindset that saw the entire world as territory waiting to be explored. It's like being born into a family where, because it's never been done before, is considered the best possible reason to try something. What's really beautiful about this moment in history is how it reveals something profound about human nature. Here's a man who's already living on the edge of the world in Greenland, and his response to hearing about lands even further away is, "Let's go check it out." The taste of curiosity becomes more powerful than the taste of safety. The psychological impact of growing up in such an environment cannot be overstated. When your normal childhood includes stories about discovering new continents and establishing settlements in impossible conditions, your definition of realistic goals becomes very different from most people. The sound of impossible dreams becomes the soundtrack to daily life. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. Leif Erikson probably never realized he was about to become one of the most important explorers in human history. To him, this was probably just another family business venture, another chance to follow in his father's footsteps, and maybe find some good timber or trading opportunities. It's like accidentally inventing the internet while trying to send a better email. The most quotable lesson from Leif's background is that great discoveries aren't usually planned. They're what happen when prepared people meet unexpected opportunities. While Columbus would later sail west with grand theories about reaching Asia, Leif was just following up on a fishing story with the practical goal of seeing what was actually out there. What happens next in Leif's incredible journey will make this family background look like gentle preparation for one of the most audacious voyages in human history. Because we're about to witness the moment when a Viking ship disappears over the western horizon into waters no European has ever sailed, and discover whether courage and curiosity are enough to survive when you're literally sailing off the edge of the world. The real question isn't whether Leif will find new lands. It's whether he'll live long enough to tell anyone about them. And trust me, what we discover about Viking navigation techniques will make every GPS system you've ever used look like amateur hour. Because when you're sailing into the unknown without maps, compasses, or any idea what you might find, every decision becomes a masterclass in the art of educated guessing with life or death consequences. So, we've just watched Leif Erikson decide to investigate mysterious lands based on a second-hand fishing story, and now We're about to witness something that will make every GPS navigation system you've ever used look like amateur hour. Because what happens next isn't just about sailing west. It's about the moment when human beings literally sailed off the edge of the known world, using nothing but stars, stones, and centuries of accumulated wisdom that would make modern navigators weep with envy. And honestly, if there's one thing that proves our ancestors had superpowers we've completely forgotten about, it's watching Viking navigators cross 1,0 miles of open ocean without a single piece of modern technology and somehow end up exactly where they intended to go. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of Leif's ship in the year 1000, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of endless ocean, it's the smell. The rich, salty scent of North Atlantic seawater, mixed with the tar and wool that waterproofs your ship, plus the distinctly Viking aroma of 35 unwashed men who've been eating dried fish and fermented milk for weeks. The sound of waves slapping against the wooden hull creates a rhythm that becomes your heartbeat, because when you're sailing into waters no European has ever mapped, every creak of the ship becomes a conversation between you and the unknown. Now, forget what you think you know about ancient navigation being primitive guesswork by people who barely understood their own world, because Viking navigators were essentially human GPS systems who could read the ocean like a book written in currents, bird flights, and the behavior of clouds. It's like watching someone navigate by reading the matrix code of the natural world, except instead of green numbers, they're interpreting the language of wind patterns and whale migrations. But here's where this story gets absolutely mind-blowing. Leif and his crew are using navigation techniques so sophisticated that modern sailors are still trying to figure out how they worked. The most famous example is the legendary sunstone, a crystal that could supposedly locate the sun even on completely overcast days. It sounds like fantasy, but scientists have actually proven that certain crystals can polarize light in ways that reveal the sun's position through thick clouds. The most quotable thing about Viking navigation is that they didn't just sail across oceans, they read them like newspapers written in a language only they understood. While modern sailors rely on satellites and computers, Vikings relied on something far more impressive: the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to interpret every possible sign the natural world could offer. The taste of salt spray becomes a form of communication between sailor and sea. What makes this voyage so universally terrifying is understanding what Leif is actually attempting. He's following Bjarne's route in reverse, which means sailing west from Greenland into waters that might be empty ocean stretching to infinity. There's no backup plan, no rescue service, and no way to call for help if things go wrong. It's like deciding to walk to the moon because someone told you they saw something interesting up there. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. Viking navigation was essentially the ultimate example of trusting your training when you can't see the destination. Every entrepreneur, every artist, every person who's ever taken a leap of faith into the unknown is channeling a tiny bit of that Viking navigator spirit. The feel of uncertainty becomes familiar when you realize that the most important journeys always begin with sailing toward horizons you can't see. But what's really beautiful about Viking seamanship is how it demonstrates the power of collective knowledge. These navigation techniques weren't invented by individuals. They were developed over centuries by communities of sailors who shared information, tested theories, and gradually built a body of knowledge that could guide ships across vast distances. It's like watching the world's first open-source navigation system, except instead of code, they're sharing stories about bird behavior and ocean currents. The psychological pressure of this kind of navigation cannot be overstated. Leif has to maintain confidence in techniques he's learned from other people, while also being ready to adapt when conditions don't match anything in his experience. It's like being a pilot who has to fly by instruments, while also being prepared to invent new instruments if the old ones stop working. What's absolutely mind-blowing about this voyage is how it reveals the incredible sophistication of medieval maritime technology. Viking ships were designed specifically for long-distance ocean travel, with shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate both open seas and coastal waters, plus flexible construction that could bend with waves instead of breaking. The sound of wood flexing under stress becomes reassuring rather than alarming when your ship is designed to dance with the ocean rather than fight it. The most quotable wisdom from Viking navigation is that sometimes the most advanced technology is the kind that doesn't look like technology at all. While we think of navigation as requiring complex instruments, Vikings proved that the most reliable guidance system is a trained human brain that knows how to read the natural world. The smell of approaching weather becomes more accurate than any barometer. Here's what makes this story so universally relatable. We've all been in situations where we had to navigate without clear directions. Leif Erikson represents every person who's ever had to trust their instincts and training when the path ahead was completely unknown. Every time you've started a new job, moved to a new city, or tried something you'd never done before, you're experiencing a tiny version of what it feels like to sail off the edge of the known world. But what's really heartbreaking about this voyage is realizing how much knowledge has been lost to history. The navigation techniques that allowed Vikings to cross oceans with pinpoint accuracy were mostly oral traditions that disappeared when their culture changed. It's like watching a library of practical wisdom get erased because nobody thought to write down the things that everyone obviously knew. The most inspiring part of life's navigation challenge is how it demonstrates the power of preparation meeting opportunity. He's not just randomly sailing west and hoping for the best. He's following specific techniques, reading specific signs, and making calculated decisions based on centuries of accumulated expertise. The feel of wind direction becomes a form of communication with forces larger than yourself. What's really beautiful about this moment in maritime history is how it proves that courage and knowledge aren't opposites, they're partners. The bravest thing Leif does isn't ignoring the risks of ocean navigation. It's trusting his training enough to attempt something that seems impossible. Every successful risk-taker understands this balance between audacity and expertise. The psychological transformation that happens during long ocean voyages is absolutely fascinating. After weeks of seeing nothing but water in every direction, sailors develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to tiny changes in weather, current, and wildlife behavior. It's like watching people evolve enhanced senses in real time, becoming more attuned to their environment than most humans ever experienced. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. The navigation techniques that seem primitive to modern eyes were actually more sophisticated than many contemporary methods. While we rely on satellites and electronics that can fail, Vikings relied on natural phenomena that are always available and always accurate. It's like comparing someone who can read the stars to someone who can only read a GPS screen. The most quotable lesson from Viking seamanship is that the most reliable technology is the kind that works even when everything else fails. Natural navigation techniques don't require batteries, satellites, or maintenance. They just require knowledge and practice. The sound of waves becomes a more trustworthy guide than any electronic device. What's really inspiring about this voyage is how it reveals something profound about human potential. Here are people using nothing but observation, memory, and inherited wisdom to accomplish something that still impresses us 1,000 years later. It's a reminder that the most important tools we have aren't external devices. They're the capabilities we can develop within ourselves. The most heartbreaking part of this navigation story is imagining the conversations between experienced sailors and younger crew members. Picture Leif sharing navigation secrets that his father, Eric the Red, had taught him, passing down knowledge that represents generations of hard-won expertise. Every technique, every observation, every piece of advice represents someone's survival depending on getting it right. But here's what makes this story so eternally relevant. Leif's navigation challenge is basically the ultimate metaphor for any situation where you have to move forward without knowing exactly where you're going. Whether you're starting a business, raising children, or pursuing a dream, the principles are the same. Trust your training, read the signs, and keep moving toward your goal, even when you can't see it. What happens next will make this navigation masterclass look like gentle preparation for the ultimate test of Viking seamanship. Because we're about to witness the moment when Leif's ship finally approaches the coast of North America, and discover whether all this sophisticated navigation was worth the risk of sailing off the edge of the world. The real question isn't whether Viking navigation techniques work, it's whether Leif will recognize success when he sees it. And trust me, what we discover about the first European landing in America will make every exploration story you've ever heard look like a gentle day trip. Because when you've spent weeks sailing into the unknown, the moment you finally see land becomes more than just navigation success. It becomes proof that impossible dreams can become reality if you're brave enough to sail toward them. So we've just watched Hannibal somehow survive the Alps crossing with a battered but psychologically invincible army. And now we're about to witness something that will make every military upset you've ever heard about look like a gentle disagreement. Because what happens next isn't just a battle, it's the moment when the most powerful empire in the world discovers that all their military assumptions are not just wrong, they're catastrophically, hilariously, devastatingly wrong. And honestly, if there's one thing that proves genius can literally rewrite the laws of warfare, it's watching Hannibal turn the Battle of Cannae into the ultimate masterclass in how to destroy a much larger army through pure tactical brilliance. Picture this. It's August 216 BC, and you're a Roman soldier standing in the largest army Rome has ever assembled. The smell of confidence fills the air as 86,000 Roman and allied troops prepare to finally crush this upstart Carthaginian who's been embarrassing the empire for 2 years. The sound of 68,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry moving into formation creates a rhythm of inevitable victory. Because honestly, how could anyone possibly defeat this many Romans? But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. Hannibal is looking at this massive army and thinking, perfect. The bigger they are, the more spectacular their fall will be. Now, forget what you think you know about ancient battles being chaotic melees, where the biggest army usually wins, because Hannibal is about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to your enemy is let them bring exactly the kind of army they think will guarantee victory. While the Romans are thinking in terms of overwhelming force, Hannibal is thinking in terms of physics, psychology, and the art of turning your enemy's strengths into their greatest weaknesses. The Roman battle plan is so straightforward it's almost adorable. March their massive infantry force straight into Hannibal's center and crush everything through sheer weight of numbers. It's like bringing a sledgehammer to solve every problem, except the problem you're trying to solve is actually a puzzle that requires finesse. The taste of traditional Roman confidence must have been sweet on the tongues of consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro as they prepared to end Hannibal's Italian adventure once and for all. But here's where Hannibal's genius becomes absolutely mind-blowing. He deploys his 50 zero-man army in a formation that looks like a bow, with his weakest troops in the center and his strongest African veterans hidden on the flanks. It's like setting up a trap that's so obvious it becomes invisible. Because who would expect someone to deliberately put their worst soldiers where the enemy is going to hit hardest? The most quotable thing about Hannibal's tactical setup is that sometimes the best way to win is to let your enemy think they're winning, right up until the moment they realize they've destroyed themselves. While the Romans are focused on breaking through his center, Hannibal is orchestrating a symphony of destruction that will make their numerical advantage completely irrelevant. What makes this moment so universally relatable is that we've all been in situations where someone tried to overpower us instead of outthinking us. Maybe it's a workplace bully who thinks volume equals authority, or a competitor who assumes bigger budgets guarantee better results. Hannibal represents every underdog who's ever realized that intelligence can beat force if you're clever enough to use your enemy's aggression against them. Here's where this story gets absolutely wild. As the Roman infantry charges into Hannibal's center, his Spanish and Gallic troops begin a controlled retreat that draws the Romans deeper and deeper into what amounts to a killing funnel. The feel of victory becomes intoxicating for Roman soldiers as they push forward, thinking they're breaking Hannibal's line, not realizing they're walking into the most sophisticated trap in military history. But the real genius of Hannibal's plan becomes clear when you understand the psychology behind it. The Romans are so focused on their frontal assault that they don't notice Hannibal's cavalry systematically destroying their own cavalry on both flanks. It's like being so focused on winning an argument that you don't notice someone quietly removing all your escape routes. What's really beautiful about this tactical masterpiece is how it demonstrates the power of patience and precision over brute force. As the Roman center pushes deeper into Hannibal's deliberately weakening line, they become more and more compressed, unable to use their superior numbers effectively. The sound of Roman war cries gradually changes from confident to confused as soldiers realize something is going very, very wrong. The moment when Hannibal springs his trap is like watching a master magician reveal the trick that's been happening in plain sight all along. His African veterans, who've been waiting patiently on the flanks, suddenly wheel inward and attack the Roman flanks while his cavalry charges into their rear. The smell of Roman confidence instantly transforms into the metallic scent of terror as 86 zero men realize they've been completely outmaneuvered. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. Hannibal essentially invents the concept of the double envelopment, a tactical maneuver that military academies still study 200 years later. While the Romans are playing checkers with overwhelming force, Hannibal is playing three-dimensional chess with physics and psychology. The psychological impact of this encirclement cannot be overstated. Roman soldiers who moments before were confident of victory suddenly find themselves trapped in an ever-shrinking circle of death, pressed so tightly together they can barely lift their weapons. The taste of panic becomes overwhelming as men who've never experienced defeat realize they're about to become part of the worst military disaster in Roman history. What makes this moment so universally terrifying is how it demonstrates that sometimes your greatest strength can become your greatest weakness in the hands of a clever enemy. The Roman army's massive size, which should have guaranteed victory, becomes the very thing that makes their destruction so complete. It's like watching someone use your own momentum to throw you in judo. The harder you push, the more devastating your fall. The most heartbreaking part of this tactical brilliance is the human cost. When the slaughter finally ends, estimates range from 47,700 to 70 Roman soldiers lying dead on the field, with another 19,300 captured and only 14,550 managing to escape. The smell of blood and death creates an atmosphere so overwhelming that witnesses describe finding soldiers who suffocated themselves, trying to burrow into the earth to escape the horror. But here's what makes this victory so perfectly tragic. Hannibal loses only about 6,000 men, while virtually annihilating the largest army Rome has ever assembled. It's like watching someone win a boxing match by knockout while barely breaking a sweat. The disparity between effort and result is almost incomprehensible. The most quotable wisdom from Cannae is that sometimes the most dangerous person in any conflict is the one who understands that rules are just suggestions, waiting to be rewritten. While Rome is perfecting traditional warfare, Hannibal is inventing entirely new categories of tactical thinking. The feel of revolutionary genius becomes as tangible as the mountain air he once breathed. What's really mind-blowing about this battle is how it reveals the gap between tactical brilliance and strategic success. Despite achieving what military historians consider the perfect battle, Hannibal still can't force Rome to surrender. It's like winning every argument but still losing the relationship. Sometimes being right isn't enough if you can't convert tactical victories into strategic objectives. The psychological impact of Cannae on Rome cannot be overstated. When news of the disaster reaches the city, panic grips the population, and the consul Paulus lies among the dead, along with 80 senators and 29 military tribunes. The sound of collective grief echoes through Roman streets as an empire realizes that their military invincibility was just an illusion waiting to be shattered. But here's the kicker that makes this story so eternally relevant. Cannae proves that innovation beats tradition when tradition stops adapting. Every industry disruption, every technological revolution, every moment when the underdog beats the favorite, follows the same basic pattern we're seeing on this ancient battlefield. What happens next will make this tactical masterpiece look like preparation for an even more profound lesson about the relationship between genius and tragedy. Because we're about to discover that sometimes the most brilliant victories can also be the most pyrrhic, and that winning the perfect battle doesn't always mean winning the war. Hannibal's greatest triumph is about to become the beginning of his ultimate downfall, and the lesson it teaches about the price of genius will echo through military history forever. And trust me, what we learn about the aftermath of Cannae will make every strategic decision you've ever questioned look like child's play. Because sometimes the most important choice isn't how to win the battle, it's what to do after you've won it so perfectly that everyone expects you to be invincible. So we've just witnessed Leif Erikson become the first European to set foot in North America, proving that Vikings were basically the ultimate overachievers who casually discovered entire continents 500 years before anyone else even knew they existed. But now we're about to discover something that will make every what-if conversation you've ever had about history feel like gentle speculation compared to the ultimate historical tragedy. And honestly, if there's one thing that proves timing is everything in the history business, it's watching the most important discovery in human exploration get quietly forgotten because nobody could figure out how to make it profitable. Picture this. You're Leif Erikson in the year 1001, standing on the shores of what we now know as North America, and you've just accomplished something that won't be repeated for 5 centuries. The smell of wild grapes and unfamiliar forests fills the air as you realize you've found a land so rich in resources it could change everything. The sound of waves lapping against a coastline that no European has ever seen creates a soundtrack to what should be the most celebrated moment in exploration history. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly tragic. You have no idea you've just discovered what will become the most powerful continent on Earth. Now, forget what you think you know about great discoveries, automatically changing the world. Because Leif's discovery of Vinland represents the ultimate example of being right at the wrong time, in the wrong place, with the wrong resources to capitalize on being absolutely, spectacularly correct. It's like inventing the internet in 1850. Brilliant idea, but the infrastructure to make it work just doesn't exist yet. The most quotable tragedy of Vinland is that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that happen before the world is ready to understand their importance. While Leif is busy exploring coastlines that will eventually host New York and Boston, he's thinking in terms of timber and grapes, not realizing he's standing on the future economic powerhouse of the world. The taste of wild berries becomes a footnote when it should have been the flavor of historical revolution. What makes this story so universally heartbreaking is understanding the practical challenges that doomed Norse settlement in America. The distance from Greenland to Vinland was manageable for exploration, but maintaining permanent settlements required supply lines, reinforcements, and resources that the Norse simply couldn't sustain. It's like trying to run a startup from your garage when your garage is 0 miles away from your customers and suppliers. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. The Norse encountered the same challenge that faces every early adopter. Being first doesn't guarantee being successful. While Leif had the vision and courage to reach America, he didn't have the demographic pressure, technological infrastructure, or economic incentives that would later drive Columbus and subsequent European exploration. But what's really fascinating about the failure of Vinland settlements is how it reveals the importance of timing in historical success. The Norse discovered America during the medieval warm period, when sailing conditions were optimal, but they also discovered it before European population pressure and economic competition created the desperate need for new lands. The feel of perfect weather becomes irrelevant when you don't have the social and economic storms that make exploration necessary rather than optional. The psychological impact of this missed opportunity cannot be overstated. Imagine being part of a civilization that casually discovered America and then basically shrugged and went back to farming in Greenland. It's like finding oil in your backyard and deciding you're not really interested in being rich. The sound of opportunity knocking becomes background noise when you don't recognize the voice. What's absolutely mind-blowing about the Norse approach to Vinland is how it demonstrates the difference between exploration and colonization. Leif and his followers were excellent at discovering new lands, but they lacked the systematic approach to settlement that would later characterize European expansion. It's like being great at finding amazing restaurants but terrible at opening your own. The most quotable wisdom from the Vinland experience is that discovery without follow-through is just expensive tourism. While the Norse proved that reaching America was possible, they never developed the institutional support, financial backing, or demographic pressure necessary to make permanent settlement viable. The smell of success becomes fleeting when you can't figure out how to bottle it. Here's what makes this story so universally relatable. We've all had moments when we discovered something amazing but couldn't figure out how to capitalize on it. The Norse experience with Vinland represents every person who's ever had a brilliant idea at the wrong time or in the wrong circumstances, every startup that was too early for its market, every invention that preceded the infrastructure to support it, every vision that was ahead of its time. But what's really heartbreaking about the abandonment of Vinland is understanding the human cost. Norse families who attempted to settle in America faced constant danger from hostile indigenous peoples, supply shortages, and the psychological stress of being completely cut off from their home culture. The taste of adventure becomes bitter when adventure turns into survival horror. The most tragic part of this story is how close the Norse came to changing world history. If they had managed to establish permanent settlements in Vinland, the entire trajectory of European-American contact might have been completely different. Instead of the sudden, devastating collision of cultures that characterized later European colonization, we might have seen gradual, sustained contact that could have been less catastrophic for indigenous peoples. What's really inspiring about the Vinland story is how it demonstrates that failure doesn't diminish the courage required for the attempt. Leif Erikson and his followers proved that human beings could cross oceans and discover new continents using nothing but courage, skill, and determination. The feel of that achievement remains impressive, even when the follow-through falls short. The psychological complexity of the Norse relationship with Vinland is almost impossible to comprehend. They discovered paradise and then decided it was too much trouble to keep. It's like winning the lottery and then deciding you don't want to deal with the paperwork. The sound of waves on American shores becomes a song that nobody bothered to learn the words to. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. The Norse abandonment of Vinland probably saved them from the conflicts and complications that would later consume European colonial efforts. While later European colonizers got rich and powerful through American expansion, they also got trapped in centuries of warfare, slavery, and cultural destruction. Sometimes the road not taken is the road that leads to peace. The most quotable lesson from Vinland's abandonment is that sometimes the wisest thing you can do is recognize when you're not ready for your own success. The Norse may have lacked the resources to sustain American settlements, but they also lacked the ruthless ambition that characterized later European expansion. Their failure to colonize America might have been their greatest moral victory. What's really beautiful about this story is how it reveals something profound about the relationship between discovery and destiny. The Norse proved that reaching America was possible, but they also proved that possibility doesn't automatically become reality. Every dream requires not just vision and courage, but also timing, resources, and circumstances that align in ways that can't be forced. The most heartbreaking part of the Vinland story is imagining the conversations between Norse settlers as they decided to abandon their American settlements. Picture families who had risked everything to build new lives in a new world, slowly realizing that the dream was bigger than their ability to sustain it. The smell of smoke from abandoned settlements becomes a metaphor for dreams that burn bright but can't be maintained. But here's what makes this story so eternally relevant. The Norse experience with Vinland is basically the ultimate example of being ahead of your time. Every innovator, every visionary, every person who's ever seen possibilities that others couldn't understand faces the same challenge that faced Leif Erikson. How do you sustain a vision when the world isn't ready to support it? The most inspiring part of this tragic story is how it demonstrates that some achievements transcend their immediate success or failure. Leif Erikson's discovery of America didn't change the medieval world, but it proved that human beings could accomplish things that seemed impossible. Every subsequent explorer, Every person who ever dared to sail toward unknown horizons was following in the wake of Viking ships that had already proven it could be done. As we prepare to leave the shores of Vinland and the saga of Norse exploration behind, remember that their story isn't really about failed colonization or missed opportunities. It's about the eternal human drive to explore, to discover, to push beyond the boundaries of the known world, even when we can't predict or control the consequences. The feel of that courage becomes as real as the salt spray that once filled Viking sails. What happens next in our journey through history's most remarkable figures will make Leif's exploration look like preparation for something even more transformative. Because we're about to meet someone who didn't just discover new lands, he created an entirely new civilization from the fragments of a collapsing world. Charlemagne is waiting in the ruins of the Roman Empire, and he's about to show us what happens when someone refuses to accept that the end of one world means the end of all worlds. The real wisdom of Leif Erikson's story isn't about success or failure. It's about what it means to be brave enough to sail toward horizons that might not exist, and wise enough to know when to turn back. He proved that the most important discoveries aren't always the ones that change everything immediately. Sometimes they're the ones that prove change is possible, even when the time isn't right. And that's a lesson that transcends any particular ocean or century. It's about what it means to be courageously, impossibly, eternally human. So we've just watched Leif Erikson prove that the most important discoveries are sometimes the ones that happen before the world is ready to understand their importance. And now we're about to meet someone who makes every empire-building story you've ever heard look like amateur hour. Because what happens next isn't just about medieval politics. It's about a man who literally took the smoldering ruins of the Roman Empire and said, "You know what? I'm going to build something even better." And honestly, if there's one person in history who proves that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept that civilization is over, it's Charlemagne, the Frankish king who basically invented modern Europe while everyone else was still figuring out how to survive the Dark Ages. Picture this. You're scrolling through LinkedIn, reading about inspiring business leaders and their rise to success, when suddenly you realize you're looking at stories that pale in comparison to what happened in 8th century Europe. The smell of opportunity, mixed with the smoke of burning libraries, fills your imagination as you try to comprehend a man who didn't just build a company, he built an entire civilization from scratch. The sound of construction echoes through your mind, but instead of office buildings, it's cathedrals, schools, and the very foundations of what would become modern European culture. Now, forget what you think you know about medieval kings, being simple warlords who ruled through fear and violence. Because Charlemagne was essentially the ultimate startup founder, except his startup was Western civilization, and his business plan involved conquering, converting, and educating half of Europe. It's like watching someone decide that instead of disrupting one industry, they're going to disrupt the entire concept of how human societies function. But here's where Charlemagne's story gets absolutely mind-blowing. He inherited a kingdom in 768 CE that was basically a collection of warring tribes speaking different languages, following different laws, and worshiping different gods. The taste of chaos must have been familiar on his tongue as he looked at his inheritance and realized he'd basically been handed a medieval startup with no product, no customers, and competitors who wanted to kill him. It's like being appointed CEO of a company that's simultaneously bankrupt, on fire, and under investigation by every regulatory agency in existence. The most quotable thing about Charlemagne's early reign is that he didn't just unite Europe. he invented the idea that Europe could be united. While his contemporaries were thinking in terms of tribal territories and seasonal raids, Charlemagne was envisioning something unprecedented. A continent-spanning empire based on shared laws, shared faith, and shared culture. The feel of revolutionary thinking becomes as tangible as the weight of a crown that nobody thought could exist. What makes this transformation so universally inspiring is how it demonstrates the power of vision over circumstances. Charlemagne looked at the fragmented remains of Roman civilization and saw not ruins, but raw materials for something even greater. Every broken aqueduct became a foundation for a new cathedral. Every abandoned city became the site of a new school. Every tribal conflict became an opportunity to demonstrate the benefits of unified law. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. Charlemagne essentially created the first European Union, except instead of economic treaties, he used military conquest, religious conversion, and educational reform. While modern politicians struggled to coordinate policy between neighboring countries, Charlemagne was coordinating everything from currency to curriculum across territories that stretched from Spain to Poland. But what's really beautiful about Charlemagne's approach is how he understood that lasting power comes from building systems, not just winning battles. For every territory he conquered, he immediately established schools, appointed educated administrators, and created legal frameworks that could function without his personal presence. The sound of construction becomes more important than the sound of warfare, as Charlemagne proves that the most powerful weapon is often a well-designed institution. The psychological profile of someone who attempts this kind of civilizational engineering is absolutely fascinating. Charlemagne had to be confident enough to challenge every existing power structure in Europe, while also being patient enough to build replacement systems that would outlast his own lifetime. It's like being simultaneously a revolutionary and a conservative, someone who destroys the old world while carefully preserving everything worth saving. What's absolutely mind-blowing about Charlemagne's vision is how it combined military pragmatism with intellectual idealism. He wasn't just conquering territories. He was collecting scholars, preserving manuscripts, and creating the educational infrastructure that would eventually produce the Renaissance. The smell of parchment and ink becomes as important as the scent of battlefield smoke, because Charlemagne understood that empires built on ideas last longer than empires built on swords. The most quotable wisdom from Charlemagne's early reign is that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is insist that civilization is possible when everyone else has given up on it. While his contemporaries were adapting to the collapse of Roman order, Charlemagne was actively working to create something better. It's the difference between managing decline and engineering renaissance. Here's what makes this story so universally relatable. We've all been in situations where we had to build something new from the wreckage of something old. Charlemagne represents every person who's ever looked at a broken system and decided to fix it rather than work around it. Every time you've taken over a failing project, started fresh after a setback, or tried to create order from chaos, you're channeling a tiny bit of that Carolingian empire-building spirit. But what's really heartwarming about Charlemagne's approach is how he treated education as a form of national security. He established palace schools not just for nobles, but for promising students from all social classes, because he understood that a literate population was more valuable than a large army. The feel of books in young hands becomes more precious than the weight of weapons, because Charlemagne was playing a longer game than most conquerors could imagine. The most inspiring part of Charlemagne's story is how it proves that sometimes the most important battles are fought against ignorance rather than enemies. While other kings were busy raiding and pillaging, Charlemagne was busy copying manuscripts and founding libraries. It's like watching someone choose to be a teacher instead of a warlord, except the classroom is an entire continent. What's really beautiful about this moment in history is how it reveals something profound about leadership. Charlemagne didn't just want to rule people, he wanted to improve them. Every law he enacted, every school he founded, every scholar he supported was part of a larger vision of what human society could become if someone cared enough to make it better. The psychological impact of Charlemagne's vision on his contemporaries must have been staggering. Here's a king who's not content with traditional royal activities like hunting and feasting. He's personally learning Latin, studying theology, and debating educational policy with the greatest minds of his age. The sound of intellectual discussion becomes as familiar in royal halls as the clang of weapons. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. The man who would become known as the father of Europe started out as just another Frankish tribal leader in what most people considered the barbarian fringe of civilization. While the Byzantine Empire was busy preserving the last remnants of Roman culture, this barbarian was actively creating the foundation for something that would eventually surpass Rome itself. The most quotable lesson from Charlemagne's early vision is that greatness isn't about inheriting a perfect situation. It's about having the courage to create one. Every successful leader, every transformative figure, every person who's ever built something lasting has faced the same challenge that faced Charlemagne. How do you create order from chaos without becoming part of the chaos yourself? What's really inspiring about this story is how it demonstrates that the most powerful revolutions are often the ones that look like restorations. Charlemagne claimed he was reviving the Roman Empire, but what he actually created was something entirely new, a synthesis of Germanic warrior culture, Christian spirituality, and classical learning that had never existed before. It's like watching someone invent the future while claiming they're just fixing the past. The most heartbreaking part of Charlemagne's early reign is realizing how much knowledge and culture had been lost during the collapse of Roman civilization. He spent enormous resources tracking down manuscripts, hiring scholars, and reconstructing educational systems that had taken centuries to develop originally. It's like watching someone rebuild the internet from scratch after a global technological collapse. But here's what makes this story so eternally relevant. Charlemagne's empire building represents the ultimate example of thinking systemically rather than just tactically. While other leaders were focused on winning the next battle or surviving the next winter, Charlemagne was designing institutions that would shape European civilization for the next 1,000 years. The psychological complexity of Charlemagne's vision is almost impossible to comprehend. He had to be ruthless enough to conquer his enemies and idealistic enough to educate their children. Every decision required balancing immediate military needs against long-term cultural goals, short-term survival against generational transformation. What's really beautiful about Charlemagne's approach is how it proves that the most lasting power comes from making people better rather than just making them obedient. Every school he founded, every law he codified, every scholar he supported was an investment in human potential that would pay dividends for centuries. The smell of possibility becomes as real as the scent of parchment in newly founded libraries. What happens next in Charlemagne's incredible journey will make this visionary foundation look like gentle preparation for one of the most ambitious cultural projects in human history. Because we're about to witness the moment when this Frankish king decides that conquering Europe isn't enough. He's going to convert it, educate it, and transform it into something the world has never seen before. The real question isn't whether Charlemagne can build an empire. It's whether he can build a civilization that's worth the price he's about to demand from everyone involved. And trust me, what we discover about his methods for uniting a continent will make every management strategy you've ever learned look like amateur hour. Because when your business plan involves converting entire populations to a new religion while simultaneously teaching them to read, every day becomes a masterclass in the art of large-scale cultural transformation. So we've just watched Qin Shi transform 80 chaotic criminals into the most disciplined naval force in history. And now we're about to witness something that will make every David versus Goliath story you've ever heard look like a gentle disagreement. Because what happens next isn't just about pirates fighting governments, it's about the moment when three world empires simultaneously realize that they've created a monster they can't control. And honestly, if there's one thing that proves superior organization can defeat superior resources, it's watching Qin Shi's confederation take on China, Portugal, and Britain at the same time and somehow come out ahead. Picture this. You're sitting in a war room in Beijing, Lisbon, or London, looking at maps of the South China Sea, and the reports coming in sound like something from a fever dream. The smell of expensive ink and imperial panic fills the air as admirals try to explain how a woman who used to work in a floating brothel is now controlling the busiest shipping lanes in Asia. The sound of urgent discussions echoes through palace halls as three different empires realize they're facing something unprecedented, a pirate confederation that's more organized than most national navies. Now, forget what you think you know about pirates being disorganized criminals who occasionally raid merchant ships. Because by 1808, Qin Shi's confederation is essentially running a parallel government that controls maritime trade from the Pearl River to the Taiwan Strait. It's like watching someone build Amazon, while the existing retailers are still figuring out how to use cash registers. But here's where this story gets absolutely wild. Instead of just raiding ships randomly, Qin Shi's fleet operates a sophisticated taxation system where merchants can purchase safe passage documents that guarantee protection throughout her territory. The taste of legitimate governance becomes as real as the salt air her ships breathe, because she's not just stealing from trade, she's regulating it. It's like turning piracy into a government service with better customer satisfaction than the actual government. The most quotable thing about Qin Shi's approach to maritime warfare is that she didn't just fight empires, she outgoverned them. While the Qing dynasty is struggling with corruption and bureaucratic inefficiency, Qin Shi's confederation provides reliable protection, fair pricing, and consistent enforcement. The feel of competent administration becomes more valuable than any treasure. What makes this conflict so universally fascinating is how it reveals the gap between theoretical power and practical effectiveness. The Chinese Imperial Navy, on paper, should easily crush any pirate confederation, but in reality, they're dealing with budget constraints, political infighting, and commanders who've never faced an enemy this organized. It's like watching a startup disrupt an entire industry, while the established players are still arguing about quarterly reports. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. Qin Shi essentially proves that innovation beats tradition when tradition stops adapting. While imperial navies are still using centuries-old tactics and hierarchies, she's implementing real-time communication systems, coordinated fleet movements, and adaptive strategies that make her forces incredibly difficult to counter. But what's really mind-blowing about these naval battles is how Qin Shi uses her superior organization to multiply her effective strength. When Imperial forces engage her fleet, they're not just fighting individual ships, they're fighting a coordinated system where every vessel knows exactly what it's supposed to do, and when the sound of synchronized cannon fire becomes the audio signature of disciplined warfare, defeating chaotic tradition. The psychological impact of Qingxi's victories on her enemies cannot be overstated. Imperial commanders who've spent their careers fighting conventional enemies suddenly find themselves outmaneuvered by tactics they don't understand and can't predict. It's like watching chess grandmasters get defeated by someone playing a completely different game on the same board. What's really beautiful about these maritime conflicts is how they demonstrate the power of meritocracy over aristocracy. While imperial navies are commanded by officers chosen for their family connections and political loyalty, Qingxi's fleet is led by people promoted based on competence and results. The smell of earned authority becomes more powerful than the scent of inherited privilege. Here's where this story becomes the ultimate masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Qingxi doesn't try to match the Empire's ship for ship or gun for gun. She creates conditions where her advantages in speed, coordination, and local knowledge make their numerical superiority irrelevant. It's like watching someone win a war by changing the rules of engagement entirely. The most shocking part of these conflicts is how they reveal the limitations of imperial power. Despite having the resources of entire empires behind them, Chinese, Portuguese, and British forces repeatedly failed to achieve decisive victories against Qingxi's confederation. The taste of imperial frustration becomes bitter as admirals realize that all their advantages mean nothing if they can't bring them to bear effectively. But what makes this maritime warfare so addictive is watching Qingxi turn every imperial strength into a weakness. Their larger ships are slower and less maneuverable in shallow coastal waters. Their complex command structures create delays in decision-making, and their unfamiliarity with local conditions makes them vulnerable to ambushes. It's like watching someone use judo principles in naval combat. The most quotable wisdom from these battles is that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the most weapons. It's the one who knows how to use their weapons most effectively. While the empires are focused on building bigger ships and hiring more sailors, Qingxi is focused on making every ship and every sailor more effective. What's really heartbreaking about these conflicts is the human cost on both sides. Imperial sailors who join their navies, expecting to fight conventional enemies, find themselves dying in battles they don't understand, against an enemy they've been taught to despise. The sound of cannon fire becomes a reminder that even the most brilliant strategies are written in blood and suffering. Here's the kicker that makes this story so eternally relevant. Qingxi's victories prove that sometimes the most important battles are won not through superior force, but through superior thinking. Every successful business disruption, every military innovation, every moment when the underdog beats the favorite follows the same basic pattern we're seeing in the South China Sea. The psychological transformation of both sides during these conflicts is absolutely fascinating. Imperial forces gradually shift from confident superiority to grudging respect to desperate frustration, while Qingxi's pirates evolve from criminals to professional naval officers with genuine pride in their service. It's like watching two different civilizations discover what they're really capable of. But the most beautiful part of these maritime battles is how they demonstrate that competence transcends social status. Qingxi's fleet includes former fishermen, escaped slaves, and dispossessed farmers who prove they can outfight and outthink the products of imperial naval academies. The feel of earned respect becomes more valuable than any inherited authority. What's really inspiring about these conflicts is how they prove that innovation can emerge from the most unexpected places. While the empires are perfecting traditional naval warfare, Qing Shi is inventing entirely new approaches to maritime strategy that won't be formally studied in military academies for another century. The smell of revolutionary thinking becomes as real as the gunpowder smoke that fills the air. The most tragic part of these battles is realizing how many brilliant innovations probably died with the people who created them. Qing Shi's tactical innovations, her organizational methods, her leadership techniques, most of them were never formally recorded because the people implementing them were considered criminals by the societies that should have been learning from them. But here's what makes this story so universally powerful. These maritime conflicts prove that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to accept that you're supposed to lose. Every time Qing Shi's fleet engages imperial forces, they're not just fighting for treasure or territory. They're fighting for the right to exist on their own terms. The most quotable lesson from these epic sea battles is that victory doesn't always go to the strongest. It goes to the smartest, the most adaptable, and the most determined. While the empires are playing by rules written centuries ago, Qing Shi is writing new rules in real time. The taste of that freedom becomes intoxicating for anyone who's ever felt constrained by other people's expectations. What happens next will make these maritime victories look like preparation for the ultimate test of Qing Shi's genius. Because we're about to discover that sometimes the most brilliant strategy isn't knowing how to win, it's knowing when to stop winning and start negotiating. The final chapter of her incredible story is waiting, and it's going to prove that the smartest pirates don't just know how to fight empires, they know how to make empires pay them to stop fighting. And trust me, what we learn about her retirement plan will make every business exit strategy you've ever heard about look like amateur hour. Because when you've built the most powerful naval force in the world, the question isn't whether you can keep winning, it's whether you're smart enough to cash out at the perfect moment. So, we've just watched Charlemagne conquer, convert, and educate half of Europe through a combination of military genius and educational vision, and now we're about to discover something that will make every legacy conversation you've ever had about leaving your mark on the world feel like gentle speculation. Because what happens next isn't just about the end of one man's reign, it's about witnessing the moment when a single human being's vision becomes so embedded in civilization that it literally shapes the next 1,000 years of human history. And honestly, if there's one thing that proves the most powerful immortality isn't living forever, but creating something that outlasts you by centuries, it's watching Charlemagne's empire become the foundation for everything we recognize as modern European civilization. Picture this. You're scrolling through your phone in 2025, maybe planning a trip to Europe, casually booking flights between countries that share currencies, legal systems, and cultural traditions. The smell of coffee from a cafe in Paris mingles with memories of cathedrals in Germany and universities in Italy as you take for granted a continent that functions as a unified cultural space. The sound of different languages becomes background music to a shared European identity that feels natural and inevitable. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly mind-blowing. Almost everything you recognize as European can be traced back to decisions made by one Frankish king over 200 years ago. Now, forget what you think you know about historical legacies, being simple stories of famous people doing famous things. Because Charlemagne's death on January 28, 814 CE, wasn't the end of his story. It was the moment when his ideas stopped being the vision of one man and became the operating system for an entire civilization. It's like watching someone write the code that will run every computer for the next millennium. Except instead of software, he programmed culture, law, and education. The most quotable thing about Charlemagne's legacy is that he didn't just build an empire, he built the blueprint for what Europe could become. While other medieval rulers were content with controlling territory, Charlemagne created institutions, educational systems, and cultural frameworks that would outlast any individual kingdom. The taste of permanence becomes sweeter than any temporary victory when you realize you've created something that will influence human civilization for centuries. What makes this legacy so universally inspiring is how it demonstrates the power of thinking beyond your own lifetime. Every school Charlemagne founded, every law he codified, every manuscript he preserved was an investment in a future he would never see. It's like planting trees, knowing you'll never sit in their shade. Except the trees are universities, and the shade is the Renaissance. Here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. Charlemagne essentially created the first European Union, except instead of economic treaties, he used education, law, and shared culture. The Carolingian Renaissance that he initiated became the foundation for every subsequent European cultural revival, from the 12th century Renaissance to the Italian Renaissance to the Enlightenment. Every time Europe rediscovered learning, they were essentially rediscovering Charlemagne. But what's really beautiful about Charlemagne's approach to legacy building is how he understood that lasting power comes from making people better, not just making them obedient. His palace school at Aachen became the model for cathedral schools throughout Europe, which became the model for universities, which became the foundation for modern higher education. The sound of students discussing ideas echoes across centuries as Charlemagne's educational vision evolves into the intellectual infrastructure of Western civilization. The psychological impact of Charlemagne's death on medieval Europe cannot be overstated. When news of his passing spread, it felt like the end of an era, not just because a great king had died, but because the man who had literally defined what it meant to be European was gone. It's like losing the person who invented your entire cultural identity, except that identity was so well established that it could survive without its creator. What's absolutely mind-blowing about Charlemagne's institutional legacy is how it created the framework for everything we associate with medieval and modern Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, the university system, the concept of Christendom, the idea of Europe as a unified cultural space, all of these can be traced directly back to Carolingian innovations. The feel of historical continuity becomes tangible when you realize that institutions founded over 1,000 years ago are still shaping your daily life. The most quotable wisdom from Charlemagne's legacy is that true leadership isn't about what you accomplish in your lifetime. It's about what continues to accomplish things in your name after you're gone. While other medieval rulers are remembered for their conquests, Charlemagne is remembered for creating the conditions that made future accomplishments possible. Every European university, every cathedral, every legal system that emphasizes education and cultural development is essentially a monument to his vision. Here's what makes this story so universally relatable. We've all wondered whether our work will matter after we're gone. Charlemagne represents every person who's ever tried to build something that will outlast their own life. Every teacher who inspires students, every parent who raises thoughtful children, every person who creates institutions or ideas that serve future generations is channeling a tiny bit of that Carolingian empire-building spirit. But what's really heartwarming about Charlemagne's legacy is how it demonstrates that the most powerful revolutions are often the quiet ones. While his military conquests made headlines in medieval chronicles, his educational and cultural reforms created the foundation for centuries of human progress. The smell of parchment and ink becomes more historically significant than the scent of battlefield smoke. The most inspiring part of Charlemagne's story is how it proves that sometimes the most important thing you can do is create opportunities for other people to be great. Every scholar he supported, every school he founded, every manuscript he preserved became a seed that would eventually grow into the intellectual flowering of medieval and Renaissance Europe. It's like being a venture capitalist for human potential, except your investments pay dividends for centuries. What's really beautiful about this moment in history is how it reveals something profound about the nature of true leadership. Charlemagne didn't just want to be remembered as a great king. He wanted to create a world where greatness was possible for everyone. Every law that promoted education, every institution that preserved knowledge, every cultural innovation that elevated human dignity was part of a larger vision of what civilization could become. The psychological complexity of Charlemagne's legacy is almost impossible to comprehend. He managed to be simultaneously a warrior and a scholar, a conqueror and a teacher, a medieval king and a visionary of modernity. The sound of his influence echoes through history like a symphony with movements spanning centuries, each generation adding new harmonies to themes he originally composed. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly ironic. The man who created the foundation for European unity died just as his empire was beginning to fragment into the separate kingdoms that would define medieval Europe. While his political empire didn't survive him, his cultural and educational empire became more powerful and more enduring than any territorial conquest. It's like watching someone's ideas become more influential after their death than their armies ever were during their life. The most quotable lesson from Charlemagne's entire life is that the most lasting power comes not from controlling people, but from educating them. Every tyrant in history has tried to rule through fear, but Charlemagne proved that the most effective way to shape the future is to teach people to think better. His legacy lives on not in monuments to his military victories, but in the intellectual traditions that still guide European education. What's really inspiring about Charlemagne's approach to legacy is how it demonstrates that the best way to be remembered is to make other people memorable. The scholars he supported, the institutions he founded, the cultural traditions he established, all became more famous than he was. It's the ultimate example of leadership through empowerment rather than domination. The most heartbreaking part of Charlemagne's story is realizing how much of his vision is still unrealized. He dreamed of a Europe united by education, law, and shared culture. And while we've made incredible progress, we're still working toward the kind of intellectual and cultural unity he envisioned. Every time European countries cooperate on education, research, or cultural exchange, they're essentially continuing work that Charlemagne started over 1,000 years ago. But here's what makes this story so eternally relevant. Charlemagne's legacy proves that the most important battles are fought not against enemies, but against ignorance, division, and the human tendency to settle for less than we're capable of achieving. Every person who chooses education over ignorance, cooperation over conflict, and long-term thinking over short-term gain is essentially voting for the kind of world Charlemagne tried to create. As we reach the end of our incredible journey through history's most remarkable figures and impossible lifestyles, I want you to think about what we've discovered together. We've survived with Mongol nomads who who turned the harshest conditions into the foundation for the world's largest empire, sailed with Leif Erikson as he discovered America 5 centuries before Columbus, and watched Charlemagne literally invent the concept of European civilization. The taste of these incredible stories becomes part of who we are, reminding us that human potential is far more limitless than we usually dare to imagine. Each of these legends proves that the most important battles are often fought not against our enemies, but against our own assumptions about what's possible. The sound of their courage echoes across centuries, whispering to us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept limitations. But here's what makes these stories so universally powerful. They're not really about ancient nomads, medieval explorers, or Frankish emperors. They're about the eternal human capacity to adapt, explore, and create something better than what we inherited. The feel of that possibility becomes as real as the sheets against your skin as you realize that you carry the same DNA, the same potential, the same capacity for greatness that drove these historical legends. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that you are the descendant of people who survived impossible conditions, discovered unknown worlds, and built civilizations from nothing but vision and determination. You carry in your genes the same resilience that helped Mongol families thrive on the steppes, the same curiosity that drove Viking explorers across unknown oceans, and the same creative ambition that built the foundations of modern Europe. The smell of possibility fills the air around you as you realize that every challenge you face, every obstacle that seems insurmountable, every moment when the world feels too complex or too broken, is actually an opportunity to join this incredible legacy of human achievement. You don't need to conquer empires or discover continents. You just need the same willingness to adapt, explore, and create that has driven human progress for thousands of years. And with that thought, let these stories of courage, ingenuity, and impossible dreams drift through your mind as you drift off to sleep. Sweet dreams, fellow history lovers, and remember, tomorrow is your chance to write the next chapter in humanity's ongoing story of turning limitations into legends. The most beautiful lesson from our journey tonight is that history isn't something that happened to other people in other times. It's the ongoing story of what humans can accomplish when they refuse to accept that impossible means impossible. You are part of that story, and your chapter is still being written